Hi again. Hello, friends. I'm back. Don't hate me. I really need like a flashing warning when my computer's about to just like die or do something stupid, but instead because I'm just not paying attention and it had gotten unplugged, so I didn't realize it was low on battery and it died. I'm sorry, but I'm back. So hopefully you guys, what was the last thing I said? I believe the last thing I said was the fact we were in section 22, and we were talking about how there's the two parties in the Army High Command now, and basically everyone's still trying to use this battle for their own personal good, and now that the decisive moment of the battle had come, which would either destroy Kutuzov and hand power over to Benigsen, or, even if Kutuzov won the battle, make it felt that it had all been done by Benigsen. In either case, for tomorrow, big rewards should be given out and new men brought to the fore. And owing to that, Boris Brutskoy was in nervous animation all day. That should have been the last thing we all heard. Boris, who is our young upstart career man trying to make a move in the military here. And it's so, it's such an interesting contrast so far about how Pierre is seeing all these men who are injured and wounded soldiers and all these men who are just taking it for granted. They're like, yeah, I'm sure we'll lose a lot of people tomorrow. And even like people like Boris and, other people in the military high command who are just sort of like, I'm sure a lot of people die tomorrow, which is what happens in battle. But they're basically like, I'm sure a lot of people will die tomorrow, but, they're going to just use this to their advantage. This battle to their advantage to, gain power or whatever. Hey, okay, so some of you guys are back. That's great. Feel free to say hi on the live chat, which is up, guys. I'll jump back in. Aren't you glad I have my chair back? So dramatic. So we're in Volume 3, Part 2. We're midway through Section 22, and Boris Debretskoy is in nervous animation. After Kesarov, other acquaintances came up to Pierre, and he had no time to answer all the questions about Moscow that they showered him with, or to listen to the stories they told him. Animation and anxiety showed on all their faces, but it seemed to Pierre that the cause of the agitation, which showed on some of these faces, lay mostly in questions of personal success, and he could not get out of his head those other expressions of agitation which he had seen on other faces, and which spoke of questions that were not personal, but general, questions of life and death. Kutuzov noticed Pierre's figure and the group that had gathered around him. "Call him over to me," said Kutuzov, and the adjutant conveyed his Serenity's wish, and Pierre came towards the bench. But before him, a rank-and-file militiaman came up to Kutuzov. It was Dolokhov. "What's that one doing here?" asked Pierre. "He's such a sly fox. He slips in everywhere," came the answer. "You see, he was reduced to the ranks. Now he has to get jumping. He's been submitting some projects, snuck behind the enemy's lines at night. But a fine fellow." Pierre, taking off his hat, bowed respectfully to Kutuzov. "I decided that if I had to report to your Serenity, you can chase me away or tell me you already know what I'm reporting, and I'll be none the worse for it," Dolokhov was saying. Yes, but if I'm right, then I'll be of benefit to the fatherland, for which I'm prepared to die. Yes. And if your Serenity needs a man who won't spare his hide, please remember me. Maybe I'll prove yourself useful to your Serenity. Yes, Kutuzov repeated, looking at Pierre with his laughing, narrowing eyes. Just then Boris, with his courtly adroitness, moved up next to Pierre in proximity to his superior, and with the most natural air, and not loudly, as if continuing a conversation they had already begun, said to Pierre, "The militiaman, they just went and put on clean white shirts, so as to be prepared for death. Such heroism, Count." Boris said it to Pierre in order to be heard by his Serenity. He knew that Kutuzov would pay attention to these words, and in fact his Serenity addressed him. "What's that you're saying about the militia?" he said to Boris. "They've put on white shirts, your Serenity, getting ready for tomorrow, for death." "Ah, wonderful, incomparable people," said Kutuzov, and closing his eyes, shook his head. "Incomparable people," he said with a sigh. "So you want a whiff of the powder," he said to Pierre. "Yes, a pleasant smell. I have the honor of being an admirer of your spouse. Is she well?" My camp is at your service, and as often happens with old people, Kutuzov started looking around absent-mindedly as if forgetting all he had to say or do. Evidently recalling what he was searching for, he beckoned to Andrei Sergeyevich Kesarov, his adjutant's brother. How? How do they go? Those verses of Marin's, how do they go? What he wrote at Garikov. You'll be a teacher in the corps. Recite it, said Kutuzov, obviously getting ready to laugh. Kesarov recited. Kutuzov, smiling, nodded his head in rhythm with the verses. When Pierre left Kutuzov, Dolokhov, coming up to him, offered him his hand. Very glad to meet you here, Count, he said to him loudly and unembarrassed by the presence of strangers, with particular resoluteness and solemnity. On the eve of a day when God knows who of us is destined to remain alive, I'm glad of the chance to tell you that I regret the misunderstandings that occurred between us and would wish that you do not have anything against me. I ask you to forgive me. Pierre, smiling, gazed at Dolokhov. Not knowing what to say, Dolokhov, with tears in his eyes, embraced and kissed Pierre. Boris said something to his general, and Count Benigsin turned to Pierre and proposed that he come with him along the line. It will be interesting for you, he said. Yes, very interesting, said Pierre. Half an hour later, Kutuzov left for Tatarinovo, and Benigsin, with the suite, Pierre among them, rode along the line. Section 23. From Gorky, Benigsin went down by the high road to the bridge that the officer on the barrow had pointed out to Pierre as the center of the position, and near which rows of mowed grass, smelling of hay, lay on the river bank. Crossing the bridge, they rode to the village of Borodino, where they turned left and, passing huge numbers of troops and cannon, came to a high barrow on which militiamen were digging up the ground. There was the redoubt, as yet unnamed, later known as the Revsky redoubt, or the battery of the barrow. Pierre paid no particular attention to this redoubt. He did not know that for him it would be the most memorable place on the field of Borodino. Then they crossed the ravine to Semyonovsko, where soldiers were pulling down the last logs of the cottages and barns. Then downhill and uphill they rode on through the broken rye, beaten down as if by hail, along a road newly made by the artillery, crossing the furrows of the plowed fields to the fletches, which were still being dug. Benigsin stopped at the fletches and began looking ahead at the Shevardino redoubt, still ours yesterday, and on which several horsemen could be seen. The officer said that Napoleon or Murat was there, and everyone looked eagerly at this bunch of horsemen. Pierre also looked, trying to guess which of those barely visible men was Napoleon. Finally, the horsemen rode off down the barrow and disappeared from sight. Benigsin turned to a general who came up to him and started explaining the disposition of our troops. Pierre listened to the Benigsin's words, straining all his mental forces in order to understand the essence of the forthcoming battle, but felt with chagrin that his mental ability was insufficient for that. He understood nothing. Benigsin stopped talking and noticed the figure of the listening Pierre. Suddenly said, turning to him, I suppose you find this uninteresting. Oh, on the contrary, very interesting, said Pierre, not quite truthfully. From the fletches they rode still further to the left, on a road winding through a dense, but not very tall, birch woods. In the middle of this woods, a brown hare with white legs jumped out onto the road in front of them, and frightened by the hoofbeats of the large number of horses, became so confused that it leapt along the road in front of them for a long time, arousing general attention and laughter, and only when several voices shouted at it did it dash to the side and disappear into the thicket. Having gone a mile and a half through the woods, they came out into a clearing where the troops of Tuchkov's corps were stationed and were supposed to defend the left flank. Here, at the extreme left flank, Benigsin spoke a great deal and vehemently, and, as it seemed to Pierre, gave instructions that were important in a military respect. In front of the disposition of Tuchkov's troops, there was an elevation. This elevation was not occupied by troops. Benigsin loudly criticized this error, saying that it was mad to leave a height that commanded the terrain unoccupied and place troops at the foot of it. Some generals expressed the same opinion. One in particular said it with military vehemence that they had been put there to be slaughtered. Benigsin ordered in his own name that the troops be moved to the height. This instruction to the left flank made Pierre doubt still more his ability to understand military matters. Listening to Benigsin and the general discussing the position of the troops at the foot of the hill, Pierre fully understood them and shared their opinion, but precisely for that reason he could not understand how the one who had been placed them there at the foot of the hill could have made such an obvious and crude mistake. Pierre did not know that these troops had been placed there not to defend the position, as Bennigsen thought, but had been put in a concealed spot for an ambush, that is, so as to remain unobserved and suddenly strike at the advancing enemy. Bennigsen did not know that and moved the troops forward for his own reasons, saying nothing about it to the commander-in-chief. Oh boy. Section 24. On that clear August evening of the 25th, Prince Andrei lay propped on his elbow in a broken-up shed in the village of Knyazkovo, on the edge of his regiment's disposition. Through an opening in the broken wall, he looked at a row of 30-year-old birches with chopped-off lower branches that ran along a fence, at a field with stacks of oats in it, and at some bushes in which the smoke of campfires, the soldiers' kitchens, could be seen. Narrow and unnecessary to anyone, and burdensome as Prince Andrei's life now seemed to him, he felt excited and nervous on the eve of battle, just as at the Austerlitz 7 years earlier. The orders for tomorrow's battle had been given and received. He had nothing more to do. But the most simple, clear, and therefore dreadful thoughts could not leave him in peace. He knew that tomorrow's battle was to be the most dreadful of all he had taken part in, and the possibility of death presented itself to him, for the first time in his life, with no relation to the everyday, with no consideration of how it would affect others, but only in relation to himself, to his soul, vividly, almost with certainty, simply and terribly. And from the height of that picture, all that used to torment and preoccupy him was suddenly lit up by a cold white light, without shadows, without perspective, without clear-cut outlines. The whole of life presented itself to him as a magic lantern, into which he had long been looking through a glass and in an artificial light. Now he suddenly saw these badly daubed pictures without a glass, in bright daylight. Yes, there they are, those false images that excited and delighted and tormented me, he said to himself, turning over in his imagination the main pictures of his magic lantern of life, looking at them now in that cold, white daylight, the clear notion of death. There they are, those crudely daubed figures which had presented themselves as something beautiful and mysterious. Glory, the general good, the love of a woman, the fatherland itself, how grand those pictures seem to me, how filled with deep meaning. And it's all so simple, pale, and crude in the cold white light of the morning that I feel is dawning for me. 3 main griefs of his life especially held his attention: his love of a woman, the death of his father, and the French invasion that had seized half of Russia. Love! That girl who had seemed to me all filled with mysterious forces, how I loved her! I made with poetic plans of love, of happiness with her. Oh, you dear boy, he said angrily aloud. What else? I believed in some sort of ideal love, which was to keep her faithful to me for the whole year of my absence. Like the tender dove in the fable, she was to pine away in my absence, but it's all so much simpler. It's all terribly simple and vile. My father also built up Bald Hills and thought it was his place, his land, his air, his muzhiks. But Napoleon came and, not knowing of his existence, brushed him aside like a chip of wood, and Bald Hills and his whole life fell apart. And Princess Marya says it's a trial from on high. Why a trial when he's no more and never will be? Never will be again, he's no more, so for whom is a trial? The fatherland, the destruction of Moscow. And tomorrow I'll be killed, not even by a Frenchman, but by one of our soldiers, like the one yesterday who fired his gun just next to my ear. And the French will come, take me by the feet and head, and fling me into a pit, so as not to have me stink under their noses. And new conditions of life will take shape, which will become habitual for other people, and I won't know about them, and I won't be there. He looked at the line of birches with their motionless yellow and green leaves and white bark gleaming in the sun. To die, to be killed tomorrow, to be no more, so that all that is here and I am not. He pictured vividly to himself his absence from this life, and the birches with their light and shade, and the fleecy clouds and the smoke of campfires. Everything around was transfigured for him and appeared as something dreadful and menacing. A chill ran down his spine. Getting up quickly, he left the shed, paced about, and went back in. Voices came from outside the shed. "Who's there?" Prince Andrei called out. Red-nosed Captain Timokin, former Dólokhov's company commander, and now, as the number of officers diminished, a battalion commander, timidly came into the shed, and after him came an adjutant and the regimental paymaster. Prince Andrei hastily got up, listened to what the officers had to tell him in the line of duty, gave them some further orders, and was about to dismiss them when he heard a familiar, lisping voice from outside the shed. "Que diable!" said the voice of a man who had run into something. Sorry. "Que diable!" said the voice of a man who had run into something. Prince Andrei looked out of the shed and saw Pierre, who had stumbled over a pole that was lying there and nearly fallen. It was generally unpleasant for Prince Andrei to see people from his world, especially Pierre, who reminded him of all those painful moments he had lived through during his last visit to Moscow. "Ah, look at that," he said. "But what fate brings you here? I'd have never expected it." As he said this, there was something more than dryness in his eyes and the expression of his whole face. There was a hostility that Pierre noticed at once. He was approaching the shed in the most animated state of mind, but seeing the expression on Prince Andrei's face, he felt embarrassed and awkward. I've come just, I've come, it's interesting," said Pierre, who had repeated the senseless word interesting so many times that day. "I wanted to see the battle." Yes, and what do your brother Masons say about the war? Is there a way to prevent it?" Prince Andrei said mockingly. "Well, what about Moscow? What about my people? Have they finally come to Moscow?" he asked seriously. "Yes. Julie Debretskoy told me. I went to see them, but missed them. They've gone to the estate outside Moscow." Let's go ahead and keep reading. Let's read one more. Section 25. The officers wanted to take their leave, but Prince Andrei, as if unwilling to be left alone with his friend, invited them to stay and have tea. Benches and tea were brought. The officers looked not with surprise at Pierre's fat, enormous figure, and listened to his stories about Moscow and about the disposition of our troops, which he had managed to ride around. Prince Andrei was silent, and his face was so unpleasant that Pierre addressed himself more to the good-natured battalion commander Timikin than to Bolkonsky. "So you've understood the whole disposition of the troops," Prince Andrei interrupted him. "How do you mean?" said Pierre. "As a non-military man, I can't say I do fully, but anyhow I understand the general disposition." "Eh bien, vous êtes plus avance que cela soit," said Prince Andrei. "Ah," Pierre said with perplexity, looking through his spectacles at Prince Andrei. "Well, what do you say about the appointment of Kutuzov?" he asked. "I was very glad of his appointment, that's all I know," said Prince Andrei. "Well, and tell me, what's your opinion of Barclay de Tolly? In Moscow, they're saying God knows what about him. How do you judge him?" "Ask them," said Prince Andrei, pointing to the officers. Pierre looked at Timikin with the condescendingly questioning smile with which everyone involuntarily addressed him. "Light has shone on us, Your Excellency, since his serenity took over," Timikin said timidly, glancing continually at his regimental commander. "How so?" said Pierre. "Why, just as regards firewood and fodder, I must tell you. You see, we were retreating from Svinetsiany, not daring to touch a twig or a wisp of hay there or anything. You see, we were leaving so he would not get it. Right, Your Excellency?" He turned to the prince. "But don't you dare. In our regiment, 2 officers were tried for that sort of thing. Well, as soon as his serenity took over, it got simple in that regard. Light shone upon us." "Then why was it forbidden before?" Timikin looked around in confusion, not understanding how and what to answer to such a question. Pierre turned the same question to Prince Andrei. "So as not to devastate the country, we were abandoning it to the enemy," Prince Andrei said with spiteful mockery. "It's very sound. Troops shouldn't be allowed to pillage the countryside and get accustomed to looting." And in Smolensk, he also reasoned correctly that the French might outflank us and that they had the greater force. But he could not understand, Prince Andrei cried in a high voice, as if suddenly bursting out. He could not understand that there it was, the first time we were fighting for Russian soil, that the spirit in the troops... He could not understand that there it was, the first time we were fighting for Russian soil, that the spirit in the troops was such as I had never seen, that we beat back the French for 2 days in a row, and that the success increased our strength 10 times. He ordered a retreat, and all our efforts and losses went for nothing. He wasn't thinking of treason. He was trying to do everything in the best possible way. He thought it all over, and that's why he's unfit. He's unfit now precisely because he thinks everything over very thoroughly and precisely, as every German ought to do. How shall I put it? Well, say your father was a German valet, and he's an excellent valet and will satisfy all his needs better than you. So let him serve. But if your father's mortally ill, you'll send the valet away and take care of your father with your own accustomed, clumsy hands and comfort him better than any skillful stranger. That's what's been done with Barclay. As long as Russia was healthy, a stranger could serve her and be an excellent minister. But once she's in danger, she needs her own man, one of the family. But in your club, you came up with the idea that he's a traitor. The only result of that slander will be that later, feeling ashamed of your own false reproach, you'll turn him from a traitor suddenly into a hero or genius, which will be still more incorrect. He's an honest and very precise German. However, they say he's a skilled commander, said Pierre. I don't understand what is meant by a skilled commander, Prince Andrei said mockingly. A skilled commander, said Pierre. Well, he's one of who has foreseen all possibilities. Well, one who has guessed the thoughts of his adversary. That's impossible, said Prince Andrei, as if the matter had long been decided. Pierre looked about him in astonishment. However, he said, they do say that war is like a game of chess. Yes, said Prince Andrei, only with this small difference, that in chess you can only think over each move. You can think over each move as long as you like. You're outside the conditions of time. And with this difference, too, that a knight is always stronger than a pawn, and that two pawns are always stronger than one. While in war, one battalion is sometimes stronger than a division and sometimes weaker than a company. Nobody can know the relative strength of the troops. Believe me, he said, if anything depended on instructions from the staff, I'd be there giving instructions, but instead I have the honor of serving here in this regiment with these gentlemen, and I think it's really on us that depends tomorrow, not on them. Success never did and never will depend on position or on ammunition or even on numbers, but least of all on position. But on what then? On the feeling that's in me, in him, he pointed to Timkin, in every soldier. Prince Andrei glanced at Timkin, who was looking fearfully and perplexedly at his commander. In contrast to his former restrained taciturnity, Prince Andrei now seemed excited. He clearly could not keep from expressing these thoughts, which came to him unexpectedly. A battle is won by him who is firmly resolved to win it. Why did we lose the Battle of Austerlitz? The French losses were almost equal to ours. But we said to ourselves early on that we had lost the battle, and so we lost it. We said that because there was no need for us to fight. We wanted to leave the battlefield as soon as we could. We've lost. Well, let's run for it. And we ran. If we hadn't said it by evening, God knows what would have happened. But tomorrow we won't say it. You say, our position, the left flank is weak. The right is overextended, he went on. That's all nonsense. It amounts to nothing. But what faces us tomorrow? 100 million of the most varied possibilities, which will be decided instantly by who runs or who will run away, theirs or ours, by whether this one or that is killed. But what's being done now is all just an amusement. The thing is that the men you rode around the position with not only don't contribute to the general course of things, but hinder it. They're concerned only with their own little interests. At such a moment, Pierre said reproachfully. At such a moment, said Prince Andrei repeated. For them, it's only the matter of what they can undermine, when they can undermine a rival and acquire one more little cross or ribbon. For me, tomorrow is this. 100,000 Russians and 100,000 French troops come together to fight. And the fact is that these 200,000 men will fight, and whoever fights hardest and spares himself least will win. And if you like, I'll tell you that whatever goes on there, whatever muddle they make us at the top, will win the battle tomorrow. Tomorrow, whatever goes on, will win the battle. That's the truth, Your Excellency. That's the veritable truth, said Timkin. No sparing ourselves now. The soldiers in my battalion, if you can believe it, refused to drink their vodka. Not on such a day, they said. Everybody fell silent. The officers stood up. Prince Andrei went out of the shed with them, giving his last orders to the adjutant. When the officers had gone, Pierre went up to the Prince Andrei and was just about to begin a conversation when, on the road not far from the shed, the hoofbeats of 3 horses were heard, and glancing in that direction, Prince Andrei recognized Wolzogen and Kausowitz, accompanied by a Cossack. They passed close by, continuing to converse, and Pierre and Andrei involuntarily heard the following phrases. Der Krieg muss in Raum beerlegt werden. Der Anschied kann ich nicht genug Preis geben, said one. War must be extended in space. I cannot put too high a price on this view. Oh ja, said the other voice. Da der Zweck ist nur den Feind schwachen, so kann man's gewiss nicht den Verlust der braver person in Achtung nehmen. Oh yes, the aim is to weaken the enemy, so one cannot pay attention to the loss of private persons. Oh ja, the first voice confirmed. Yes, im Ram Verlin, Prince Andrei repeated, snorting angrily when they had ridden by. Im this Ram. Im this Ram. I had a father and a son and a sister in Bald Hills, and it's all the same to him. There's what I was saying to you. Tomorrow these German gentlemen won't win the battle. They'll only muck up things up as much as they can because all there is in a German head is reasoning, which isn't worth a tinker's damn. But in their hearts they haven't got the whole thing needed for tomorrow, which is what's in Timikin. They gave him the whole of Europe and came to teach us. Fine teachers! His voice shrieked again. So you think the battle will be won tomorrow, said Pierre. Yes, yes, said Prince Andrei, said distractedly. One thing I would do if I had power, he began again. I would not take prisoners. What are prisoners? It's chivalry. The French devastated my home and are on their way to devastate Moscow. They've offended me and offend me every second. They're my enemies. They're all criminals to my mind, and Timikin and the whole army think the same. They must be executed. If they're my enemies, they can't be friends, whatever they might talk about in Tilsit. Yes, yes, Pierre said, gazing at Prince Andrei with flashing eyes. I agree with you completely. Completely. The question that had been troubling Pierre ever since the hill in Muzhaisk and all that day now presented itself to him as perfectly clear and fully resolved. He now understood the whole meaning and whole significance of this war and the impending battle. Everything he had seen that day, all the significant, stern expressions on the faces he had seen flash by, appearing to him in a new light. He understood that hidden, latent, as they say in physics, warmth of patriotism which was in all the people he had seen, and which explained for him why all those people were calmly and as if light-mindedly preparing for death. Take no prisoners, Prince Andrei went on. That alone would change the whole war and make it less cruel. As it is, we've been playing at war. That's the nasty thing. We act magnanimously and all that. It's like the magnanimity and sentimentality of a lady who swoons when she sees a calf slaughtered. She's so kind, she can't bear the sight of blood, but she eats the same calf in sauce with great appetite. We're told about the rules of war, about chivalry, about parleying, sparing the unfortunate, and so on. It's all nonsense. I saw chivalry and parleying in 1805. They cheated us, we cheated them. They loot other people's houses, spread false banknotes, and worst of all, kill my children and my father. And then talk about the rules of war and magnanimity towards the enemy. Take no prisoners, but kill and go to your death. Whoever has come to this, as I have, through the same sufferings. Prince Andrei, who had thought that it made no difference to him whether Moscow was or was not taken, as Smolensk had been, all at once stopped his speech from an unexpected spasm that seized his throat. He silently paced up and down a few times, but his eyes glittered feverishly and his lips trembled when he began to speak again. If there's none of this magnanimity in war, we'd go to it only when it was worth going to certain death, as now. Then there'd be no war because Pavel Ivanitch offended Mikhail Ivanitch. But if there's war like now, then it's the war, and that the intensity of the troops would not be like now. Then all these Westphalians and Hessians led by Napoleon wouldn't follow him to Russia, and we wouldn't go to fight in Austria and Prussia, not knowing why ourselves. War isn't courtesy, it's the vilest thing in the world. And we must understand that and not play at war. We must take this terrible necessity sternly and seriously. That's the whole point, to cast off the lie. And if it's war and not a game. As it is, war is the favorite pastime of idle and light-minded people. The military estate is the most honored. But what is war? What is needed for success in military affairs? What are the morals of military society? The aim of war is killing. The instruments of war are espionage, treason, and the encouragement of it. The ruin of it is the inhabitants, robbing them or stealing to supply the army. Deception and lying are all called military stratagems. The morals of the military estate are the absence of freedom, that is discipline, idleness, ignorance, cruelty, depravity, and drunkenness. And in spite of that, in it the highest estate, respected by all. All kings except the Chinese wear military uniforms, and the one who has killed the most people gets the greatest reward. They come together like tomorrow to kill each other. They slaughter and maim tens of thousands of men, and then they say prayers of thanksgiving for having slaughtered so many people, inflating the numbers, and proclaim victory, supposing that the more people slaughtered, the greater the merit. How does God look down and listen to them? Prince Andrei cried in a high, squeaky voice. Ah, dear heart, Lately, it's been too much for me to live. I see that I've begun to understand too much, and it's not good for a man to taste of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Well, it won't be long now, he added. However, you're falling asleep, and it's time I did too. Go back to Gorky, Prince Andrei said suddenly. Oh no, Prince Pierre replied, looking at Prince Andrei with frightened, commiserating eyes. Go, go. One needs a good night's sleep before a battle, Prince Andrei repeated. He went up quickly to Pierre, embraced and kissed him. Goodbye. Off with you, he cried, whether we see each other again or not. And turning hastily, he went into the shed. It was already dark, and Pierre could not make out what expression on Prince Andrei's face was, whether it was angry or tender. Pierre stood for a while in silence, considering whether to follow him or go home. No, he doesn't need it, Pierre decided to himself, and I know that this is the last time we'll see each other. He sighed deeply and rode back to Gorky. Prince Andrei, going back into the shed, lay down on the rug but could not sleep. He closed his eyes. One image succeeded another. He lingered long and joyfully over one of them. He vividly recalled one evening in Petersburg. Natasha was telling him with an animated, excited face how she had gone to pick mushrooms the previous summer and lost her way in the big forest. She incoherently described to him the dense forest and her feelings and a talk with a beekeeper she met, and interrupting herself every moment, said, No, I can't. I'm not telling it right. No, you don't understand. Even though Prince Andrei reassured her, saying that he did understand, and indeed he understood everything she wanted to say. Natasha was displeased with her own words. She sensed that she was not conveying the passionately poetic feeling with which she had experienced that day and which she wanted to bring out. He was so lovely, that old man, and it was so dark in the forest, and he was such a kind— No, I don't know how to tell it, she said, flushed and excited. Prince Andrei now smiled the same joyful smile that he had smiled then, looking into her eyes. I understood her, thought Prince Andrei. I not only understood her, but it was that inner force, that sincerity, that inner openness, that soul of hers, which was as if bound by her body. It was that soul that I loved so strongly, so happily. And suddenly he remembered what his love had ended with. He didn't need any of that. He saw none of it and understood none of it. He saw in her a pretty face and a fresh girl, with whom he did not deign to join his fate, while to this day, he's alive and cheerful. Prince Andrei jumped up as if someone had burned him and began pacing in front of the shed. And I think we'll stop it there for today. The end of section 25. And on page 777, no less. I wonder how much of these himself Tolstoy put in these characters, because sometimes I feel like he's really, using maybe the feelings he felt being part of these battles, or being observing them and observing everything. Like, a lot of his reflections of life are clearly infused into the character of Pierre and Prince Andrei. I feel like there's some, even though I don't know a lot of his life, I feel like there must be something of like self-autobiography a little bit in these characters, of maybe indecision in himself he put into Pierre, and while the sort of reflection and gaining of wisdom he maybe infused into Prince Andrei. But Prince Andrei's monologue there is just brilliant about war. Having not been a military person myself, but observing war, and especially how it's become such a tool in the Western world, the idea of how it's viewed as this, it's always portrayed as this noble thing, but it's really just killing people. It's just, and how to really succeed at it, there's so much like moral bankruptcy you have to partake in to really succeed at war. And I love his reflections about Natasha. It's sweet. I hope he doesn't die. I feel like he's gonna die. I feel like that might be the last time him and Pierre see each other. But we will see. Okay, so see you guys tomorrow, and hopefully, let's see where that will take us tomorrow. We've got to be getting close to the end of, oh no, part 2 is quite long. I was hoping we could finish volume 3, part 2 tomorrow for the weekend, but I think we'll have to carry it on into next week. Yeah, that's almost like another 45 pages, so we'll have to carry that into next week. All right, friends, have a great day. Thanks for sticking with me through this long and arduous read today. Have a great day. Bye.